It's generally been warmer than it is today by many degrees Celsius. 22 degrees average global temperature has been the norm, but then there have been 4.5 ice ages during this period of time where temperature plummets on average down to 12 degrees, even 10 degrees Celsius global average. Today, the global average temperature is 14.5 degrees Celsius. We are in an ice age called the Pleistocene. That's why both poles are covered in ice. The IPCC says that we've been the dominant cause since the mid-20th century. That's 1950. In other words, they do not ascribe the rise in temperature between 1910 and 1940, which you see there, to human-caused emissions, because we weren't emitting much back then. They only say it's the part between 1970 and the year 2000 that was caused by humans. Then what caused the rise in temperature between 1910 and 1940? Because it is identical in duration and size, 0.4 degrees over 30 years. They're both the same. Water, the most important greenhouse gas, is the only one that occurs in both liquid and gaseous phases in the atmosphere. And the liquid phase of water and the gaseous phase of water, which we call water vapor, behave in completely different way with regard to solar energy. Clouds can reflect the sun back, they can hold the heat in, depending on where they are and how thick they are, and what computer model can predict the pattern of clouds in the world. It's impossible. When we started emitting CO2, it was down to about 260 ppm. Now it's at 400. If it had gone down by the same amount as we've caused it to go up, plants would have started dying, because plants start dying at 150 ppm.
Made. And it's Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park, who was a medical doctor with postdoctorate work at Oxford. And he said, if it's science, it isn't consensus, and if it's a consensus, it isn't science. And Einstein said, I can have 100 experiments prove me right. Only one experiment can prove me wrong. When Darwin was around, there were only two faculties at the university. There was the natural sciences and there was the humanities. Today, the largest faculty in the universities are the social sciences, which I called human navel-gazing. Maurice Strong, who set up the IPCC as part of the Agenda 21, which is a world governance, okay, when they set up the IPCC, they gave them a definition of only looking at human causes of climate change. And you can't possibly do that unless you understand natural climate change. And the human portion is so small, you couldn't separate it out anyway. I mean, this is one of what's laughable about the whole CO2 issue. CO2 is only 4% of the greenhouse gases, and the human portion is 0.2% of that 4%. You mentioned Environment Canada. When Strong set this up, he did it through the World Meteorological Organization, which is made up of the weather offices of every country in the world. In other words, he set the whole scam up through the bureaucracy. And Ted Turner, for example, to control the agenda, put $1 billion of his own money into the UN. Of course, he gets a tax write-off for that. But he set up the Climate Foundation at the UN. And he put in charge of it, the chairman of the Climate Foundation is a guy by the name of Timothy Wirth, W-I-R-T-H. Wirth had been a senator, and he's the guy that held the conference or the hearings in the Senate back in 1988, at which James Hansen of NASA appeared and said, yes, I'm 99% certain that humans are causing global warming and climate change. But these wealthy people, they got together in 1968 in Rome at the estate of David Rockefeller. And they formed a group called the Club of Rome. And people can Google that for themselves. One of the members of the Club of Rome was Maurice Strong. And he, along with David Rockefeller and the Club of Rome, said that the world's overpopulated. And they justified that with research done in a book published by Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1972. And they said that there are too many people in the world, and each person is using up resources at an unsustainable rate. And therefore, we've got to reduce the world population. And Ehrlich published a book with John Holdren, who I mentioned earlier, Obama's Science Czar. They published a book in which they are arguing that with the existing constitution, the government can introduce compulsory abortions. This is how far these people were going with this. But Elaine Dewar, who was an investigative journalist for the Hamilton Spectator, she started to write a book praising all of the Canadian environmentalists like Elizabeth May and David Suzuki and Maurice Strong. And the more she researched these people, the more she discovered that they were more corrupt and manipulative and political than any of the people that they attacked. So she ended up writing an exposure of them, a book called Cloak of Greens. Well, if you think about the industrialized nation like a car, you can stop the car engine in two ways, and they're very similar because they're running on fossil fuels, okay? You can shut off the fuel supply to the engine and it will stop. But if you do that with a country, the people are going to scream immediately. That's politically impossible to do. But you can also stop the car by plugging the exhaust. So if you could show that the byproduct of these fossil fuel burning industrialized nations, CO2, was causing runaway global warming, you could then use that to shut them down. And she said, well, why did you use the UN? Why didn't you run for politics? He said, you can't do anything as a politician. He said, at the UN, I can get all the money I want, create anything I want, hire anybody I want, control the agenda and not be accountable to anybody. That's exactly what he did when he set up Agenda 21 and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But this was all orchestrated, by Strong, through the Club of Rome, through Ted Turner, and all of these very influential people that were controlling the agenda completely outside of normal governments. Most governments had no idea what was going on. Rush Limbaugh says America's the last hope for freedom. He's wrong. It's the only hope for freedom. There's no other country in the world that has free speech as its number one reason for existing. But the mainstream media have always been the power broker and the mouthpiece for the power elite. And I just want to finish by reading you a poem from 1782. Think about what's happening in America. The revolution's just occurred. America's just been established. And here's a poem from 1782. How shall I speak of thee or thy power address, the God of our idolatry, the press? By thee, religion, liberty, and laws exert their influence and advance their cause. By thee, worse plagues than Pharaoh's land befell. Diffused make earth the vestibule of hell. Thou fountain at which drink the good and wise, thou ever bubbling spring of endless lies. Like Eden's dead probationary tree, knowledge of good and evil is from thee. That's 1782, and Trump could have written that yesterday. And so what you're seeing is that's why they're trying to control the internet. The UN did a poll of 10 million people, listed 16 socioeconomic concerns. Climate change was 16th on the list of 16. The public knows something wrong. They don't know what's wrong, but they're not being stampeded anymore. And the next phase will be, of course, the exposure of what these people have done.
The target of climate policy orthodoxy is an 80% reduction, 80% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions worldwide, not just the United States, worldwide, by the year 2050. When was the last time the United States carbon dioxide emissions were that low? You can figure this out. It takes a little bit of work. It's not that hard. You've got to go through the historical data tables that are available. And the answer you come to is that the U.S. last emitted 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide around 1910, maybe 1905. That's another calculation someone else did that's pretty good. In 1910, the U.S. had only 92 million people. And if you do the math, that meant we had about 10 tons per capita emission, so about half of the level we are today with 92 million people. But from the data tables, I was able to figure out that the last time we were at 2.5 tons per capita of carbon dioxide emissions was 1875. There is a technical name for this kind of policy target. That name is Looney Tunes. There are a few nations that emitted 2.5 tons per capita that we can look at as possible models. Belize, Mauritius, Haiti, Somalia, you get the picture. Desperately poor countries emit at that level because they're poor.
So here comes some renewables. Energy crops deliver half a watt per square meter in European climates. Wind power produces a bit more, 2.5 watts per square meter, but that's only twice as big as 1.25 watts per square meter. Next, let's look at solar power. Solar panels, when you put them on a roof, deliver about 20 watts per square meter in England. Concentrating solar power in deserts delivers larger powers per unit area because you don't have the problem of clouds. And so this facility delivers 14 watts per square meter, this one 10 watts per square meter, and this one in Spain 5 watts per square meter. All renewables, much as I love them, are diffuse. They all have a small power per unit area, and we have to live with that fact. And that means if you do want renewables to make a substantial difference for a country like the United Kingdom, on the scale of today's consumption, you need to be imagining renewable facilities that are country-sized. Not the entire country, but a fraction of the country, so a substantial fraction.
If you assume that carbon dioxide is a control knob for climate, then you can control climate by reducing CO2 emissions. But if you assume that climate change primarily occurs naturally, then the Earth's climate is largely uncontrollable, and reducing CO2 emissions will do little or nothing to change the climate. Here is how and why I changed my mind. In 2010, I started digging deeper, both into the science itself and the politics that were shaping the science. I came to realize that the policy cart was way out in front of the scientific horse. The 1992 UN Climate Change Treaty was signed by 190 countries before the balance of scientific evidence suggested even a discernible human influence on the global climate. Implemented before we had any confidence that most of the warming was caused by humans. There was tremendous political pressure on the IPCC scientists to present findings that would support these treaties, and this resulted in a manufactured consensus. The blue curve shows sea level change since 1800 measured from tide gauges. The red curve shows global emissions of carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels. You can see that global sea levels were rising steadily long before fossil fuel emissions became substantial. You can also see that the steep increase in emissions following 1950 is associated with very little sea level rise between 1950 and 1990. Now, here's my take on the madhouse effect. The madhouse that concerns me is the one that has been created by some climate scientists. The madhouse is characterized by rampant overconfidence in an overly simplistic theory of climate change, enforcement of a politically motivated manufactured consensus, attempts to stifle scientific and policy debates, activism and advocacy for their preferred politics and policy, self-promotion and cashing in, and public attacks on other scientists that do not support the consensus. Maybe I should write a book.
There's actually far higher correlation between shark attacks and ice cream consumption. And that's because correlation is not necessarily causation. Causation requires correlation, but very often strong correlations are the result of a third common factor, in this case, temperature. Because when people go swimming in the summer, they come back to the beach and eat ice cream. And this was the fundamental fraud in Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth. He said, CO2 is causing the change in temperature. These are the Milankovitch cycles, in sync with the 100,000-year Milankovitch cycle, which is the changes in the Earth's orbit, in the shape of it. How would changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit affect CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere? No, they would affect temperature. And temperature would affect the ocean's temperature, and the ocean's temperature determines how much CO2 can be dissolved in it. So when it warms, CO2 comes out, and when it cools, CO2 breathes into the ocean. The ocean has 45 times as much CO2 in it as the atmosphere does.
Less solar activity means a drop in ultraviolet radiation. Mike Lockwood says this seems to affect the behaviour of the jet stream. The jet stream changes its pattern. This ends up blocking warm air from reaching northern Europe. This causes long, cold winters. But what about global temperatures as a whole?
One has to make a very clear distinction between regional climate and global climate. If we get a cold winter in Europe because of these blocking events, it's warmer, for example, in Greenland. So the average is almost no change. So it's a redistribution of temperature around the North Atlantic.
Now, over a long time, people have been counting these sunspots and have recognized that it is a clear cycle. Yes, it starts from the high latitudes and heads down to the equator. High latitude in the south heads towards the equator. But the cycle itself lasts roughly 11 years, give or take. All right, and you can see the actual sunspot count here, about 11 years. This last cycle was about 13 years, about 12 and a half, 13 years. Now, what we recognize with this cycle is that it actually does have a bearing on what happens on the Earth. For example, some have shown that when you have a minimum, very few sunspots, like this area here, you have cold and cloudy weather. When you have a lot of sunspots, it tends to become hot and sunny. Between about 1645 to 1715, there's almost no sunspots. And this wasn't because people stopped counting sunspots. It's because very few sunspots were actually observed. Now, it begins again at about 1715 and takes off. You have little dips here and there, like the so-called Dalton minimum, etc. Long-term cycles. In about the 1950s, you have the highest yet. And then we're going into the current cycle. But this period, where there were no sunspots, which is indicated by these three recent observations, this period coincided in Europe with what's called the Little Ice Age, which was one of the coldest periods on record in Europe. This is the time when birds were freezing as they flew through the air and plummeted to the ground. This is the period where you have paintings of the Thames River and other rivers frozen solid. You have these stories of people setting up little roads and shops and things like that on the Thames in order to kind of have fun with the fact that it was so cold, until it got so cold that people started dying of the cold and the food started to freeze. All right, that was this period. Now, all indications are that we're headed into another period just like that. This will be the first complete observation of one of these long cycles on the sun.
We've all heard that the Arctic ice is melting. The glaciers in Glacier National Park are melting. The important thing to remember is that melting is evidence of warming, but it does not tell you what is causing the warming. There's a picture of a white spruce stump up in the Northwest Territory of Canada. It's a very old, in the north of the Arctic Circle, very old stump. It was radiocarbon dated to be almost 5,000 years old. But the interesting thing from a climate point of view is that this stump was located 100 kilometers north of today's tree line. 100 kilometers north of any other white spruce tree today, evidence that it was warmer 5,000 years ago than it is today. They found tree stumps under the glaciers. This, you can see one right here. It's about 1 foot in diameter, still had the roots in the ground. They radiocarbon dated this stump, and it was about 1,000 years old. It grew up during the medieval warm period. So the implication is, where we have a glacier today, 1,000 years ago we had a forest. Indeed, carbon dioxide is a trace gas. One way to think about it is to picture a basketball arena with 10,000 fans. Only 4 of every 10,000 molecules in the atmosphere are carbon dioxide. And the amount that humans could have added in all of our history is only a fraction of 1 of those 10,000 molecules. That means that humans are responsible for about 1 or 2 parts per 100 of Earth's greenhouse effect. Who's heard that in the press? It's warming. 3 things you need to know about Arctic ice, though. First, it naturally comes and goes. We have historical accounts of low ice in the past. Second, Arctic ice is floating on the Arctic Ocean. If it completely melts, it won't raise ocean levels at all. You can do an experiment with a glass of water and ice. Melting ice doesn't raise ocean levels. But third, this is only 1% to 2% of Earth's ice. So we need, and this gets all the press, so we need to talk about the other 90%. Folks, this is the South Pole ice, 90% of Earth's ice, and it's getting thicker. Great story. They tunneled all the way down, hollowed out this cave, took apart the Glacier Girl, brought it up. They reconstructed it. It's flown in air shows. But the interesting thing is from 1942 to 1992, 268 feet of ice accumulated on this shrinking ice cap of Greenland. Well, Greenland is actually melting a little bit at the edges and getting thicker in the center, but overall the ice is basically rock solid, very little change.
The government proposes that the price on carbon pollution should start at a minimum of $10 per ton in 2018, rising by $10 each year to $50 per ton in 2022.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is bizarre. Carbon dioxide is not pollution. It's an odorless, harmless, invisible gas. It does not cause smoke. It does not cause smog. What you see rising from the cooling tower of that power plant, that's not carbon dioxide. Can't see carbon dioxide, that's condensing water vapor.
97% of scientists, including, by the way, some who originally disputed the data, have now put that to rest. They've acknowledged the planet is warming and human activity is contributing to it.
Well, I'm picking on everybody today. And there's that statement again, the planet is warming and human activity is contributing to it. Oh boy, that's... Well, I got to talk about this 97%. It's very unfortunate that our former president of the United States has used this. There are many, many studies on this. All of them are flawed. Here's one example. Back in 2009, Duran and Zimmerman did an online survey with the American Geophysical Union. They sent out surveys to 10,000 members. Those are the geologists of the United States. They received back 3,100 responses. They asked two questions. The first was, when compared with pre-1800 levels, do you think that mean global temperatures have generally risen, fallen, or remained relatively constant? Well, you all know the answer to that. We've been coming out of a little ice age. They've been warming. Second, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? A very fuzzy question. They didn't say, is it the main factor? Is it a dangerous factor? Just as is it significant? Then they threw out 3,000 responses because they said these aren't climate scientists. And of the 77 that responded, 75 of them said it's been warming and it's significant. So this is the opinion of 75 folks. I hold in my hand a copy of the Global Warming Petition, which was done in 2007 by the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine. There's a little bit of climate science in the front, but then there are the names of 31,000 American scientists, 9,000 PhDs, and I'm going to read you what they said. There is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing, or will in the foreseeable future, cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. Moreover, there is substantial scientific evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide produce many beneficial effects upon the natural plant and animal environments of the Earth. So don't believe that 97% nonsense. It turns out to meet this goal of an 83% cut, we'd have to forego all of our modern appliances and go back to a level of 1870, 0.2 tons of carbon dioxide per person. To give you a comparison, the nation of Nigeria today emits about 0.2 tons of carbon dioxide for each of its citizens. But 40% of the people in Nigeria don't have access to electricity, and there's only 3 cars per 100 people in Nigeria. And take a look at this. I call this the energy mountain. This black graph shows global energy consumption, which has tripled since 1965. So what I've plotted on here is the amount of wind and solar. And I had to artificially enhance the solar line so it would even show up. Wouldn't even show up. Every year, the world adds another United Kingdom worth of energy consumption. And wind and solar can't even provide for the increase, let alone replace our traditional fuels. Everyone knows that if you burn wood, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change ruled in 1996 that burning wood or biomass or biofuels was carbon neutral. And the way they made that assumption was they said, well, plants grow and absorb carbon dioxide. You cut them down and you burn them, and they release carbon dioxide. It's an even wash, carbon neutral. And so emissions from carbon dioxide, when you hear these numbers, they don't even count them in Canada, in the United States, in Europe. All those numbers are wrong. They don't count emissions from biofuels. Consider the Drex power station in England, the biggest power plant in Europe, 4 gigawatts of power. Formerly it consumed all coal, 140 coal trains a week to power the station. But because the United Kingdom and the European Union don't count biomass emissions, they converted half the plant, they converted half the plant to wood. And because they don't have enough wood in Europe or in the United Kingdom, they're shipping it 3,000 miles from North Carolina. And this cost $1 billion to convert this half of a plant. They're getting a subsidy of £1 billion a year, and they've doubled the electricity price for British consumers. And Europe is slashing subsidies and mandates in England, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Greece, Czech Republic, all across the continent.
When I say global warming, I mean the recent probable increase in global average surface temperature on multi-decadal timescales. So just defining terms. Okay, so after working on global warming for the last 20 plus years, what do we know about it now? And this is a common theme among scientists, especially us gray hairs, that the longer you go, it's like the more you get more questions than you get answers. So what do we really know about it? Almost nothing.
Am I the reason you get stoned every week? Now I'm built up integrity. Got you texting, emailing me, wanting me to feel with you. Baby, just face reality, move on. Sometimes it's hard to face reality.